They tore down my ice house while I was standing on a glacier in Iceland. That is not a metaphor. I was literally roped to a guide crampons, biting into blue ice wind, cutting my cheek, as if the world itself were trying to erase the past. By the time I was back home on my own lakefront in upstate New York, a demolition crew had turned 170 years of family history into a pile of stone and dust. My name is Daniel Mercer. 21 acres on the eastern shore of Lake Alder, 40 minutes from Albany, and the ice house had been the spine of my family story since 1884, when my great-great-grandfather worked the railroad and the valley ran on blocks of winter ice. When I say ice house, don't picture a lean-to with a rusty lock. Picture a 20-foot-tall stone structure with double-insulated walls packed with sawdust, hand-cut blocks, original timbers still bearing the gouges of 19th-century tools. It supplied ice to the whole valley before electricity made everything hum in grocery store aisles, and it survived wars, hurricanes, neglect, and then, after I poured 5 years into restoring it, it vanished in less than 48 hours. I had tracked glacial melt overseas for a living. Ironic, I know. So I get the idea of impermanence. But there's a different kind of disappearance when something people can touch and lean on is taken away. I moved back full-time in 2012 after my dad died, worked with a preservation architect named Martha Clean, documented everything, registered the place with the County Historic Board. Had it professionally surveyed, the footprint sat well inside my property line, 30 feet from any edge. For years it was a community thing, school tours, kids' wide eyes, old men like Frank Donnelly telling stories about hauling blocks in January. It was not a relic behind caution tape, it was a living piece of the town's memory. Then the Harringtons moved in. Colin and Rebecca Manhattan, money-sleek tastes and appetite for modernizing the shoreline. The first time I met Colin, I was giving a homeschool group a tour. He showed up in loafers that had probably never seen mud and peered at the ice house like it was an unpleasant surprise in a magazine spread. "That old thing yours," he said, the polite smirk already in place. "Rustic," he offered, and that word rustic lodged under my skin like a burr. Survey stakes went up. Conversations about sight lines and views started to sound casual, small, neighborly, until they weren't. Rebecca came by while I was trimming brush and mentioned offhand that their shoreline consultant felt the structure kind of blocks the sight line. I remember smiling like an idiot saying, "Good thing it's not on your land," and she didn't laugh. That was the first time I realized "we" had begun to mean they, and negotiation would be one-sided. 2 weeks later, I was in Iceland, neck-deep in work and remote fieldwork, thinking about ice and time and how landscapes fold and fold again. I had little signal. I had no idea that back home someone had brought in an excavator. When I landed in Newark and my phone chimed back to life, Frank's voicemail was tight. "Danny, you need to call me." My stomach dropped before I even dialed. The sun was lowering as I turned onto the gravel drive. For a second, everything looked the same, and then there was a gap where the ice house used to be. Open sky, a flattened rectangle of disturbed earth piles of shattered stone like a broken tooth. I sat in my truck for a long time and let the shock catch up. Frank didn't say sorry. He said they had authorization. From who, I asked. He shrugged. "From the Harringtons," he said. I walked down, and the scene felt unreal, splintered timber. My grandfather's antique ice tongs twisted under rubble, the double walls turned inside out. I called Colin. He answered casual, as if we were discussing lawn care. "Oh, that old structure, yeah, we had it removed." When I said it was on my property and listed the registry, his breath came slow and amused. "It was crumbling," he said. "We assumed it was a shared boundary. He told me to have my lawyer call his." He hung up. There's a coldness that comes with certain indignities. Not the hot flare of anger so much as a flat clinical recognition that someone decided they could take what they wanted. That night there was no sleep. I pulled out restoration photos, Martha's notes, the county listing Mercer Ice House, circa 1850s, protected. By 8 the next morning, I was in my attorney Tom Caldwell's office. Tom wears the same navy suit to everything and has a habit of tapping his pen when he's thinking. He's handled the family's smaller disputes before, but nothing that smelled this rotten. "You can't rebuild a century and a half of original fabric," he said, "but you can make them pay. And because it's protected, this could trigger preservation penalties." We put a number on the cost of authentic reconstruction, labor-intensive stonemasonry period materials, structural oversight, and the figure that came back was $890,000. It felt obscene on paper, but it was also the only thing that made sense if we were serious. He sent a certified demand fund, reconstruction, acknowledge wrongdoing, or face suit. 10 days to respond. Silence does strange things to a place. The lake felt like it was holding its breath. On day 9, the Harringtons' Manhattan Council replied politely. Clinical, the structure was unsafe. They acted in good faith, and as a gesture, they'd give $45,000 for a plaque. $45,000 for a plaque. I actually laughed aloud when Tom read it. The audacity of reducing my family's history to a brass marker stunned me more than anger did. So we filed. Trespass, destruction of protected property, punitive damages, injunctive relief to halt any development on the cleared footprint, and the county court took notice. Then the twist, while the paperwork shuffled, construction materials started arriving at the Harrington property. Lumber steel, the trappings of a lakeside cabana, and I realized they'd cleared the space not just to improve a view, but to build something that would profit from the erasure. They'd altered the shoreline grading during demolition, so the cabana would sit perfectly in the new sightline. That discovery sharpened everything. This wasn't ignorance or even clumsy enthusiasm. It had the stink of premeditated advantage. The preliminary hearing felt small and intimate. Judge Eleanor Whitaker, mid-60s, direct. Tom laid out the registry entries, the survey's expert testimony. The Harringtons' counsel talked about reasonable assumptions and safety concerns. Then the judge asked one question that unspooled their defense. Did your clients obtain written permission from the property owner before demolition? Silence. Did they commission an independent survey? Silence. Good faith requires due diligence, she said. I saw the room tilt. A temporary injunction stopped construction on the disputed footprint, and a full evidentiary hearing was scheduled. Over the next 3 months, the cabana rose like a theater prop. Steel beams, polished concrete, a lakeside bar that would have been the envy of issue-spotting homeowners' magazines. From my porch, I could watch its frame climb where my grandfather had once hauled ice blocks. I left a few stones in place on the cleared patch like a scar that refused to heal. People chose sides quietly. Preservation is popular until it collides with property values. Frank brought a six-pack and said, "They think you'll settle." I said, "I won't." He nodded. Good. The final hearing was meticulous. Preservation experts, structural engineers, the county chair. The reconstruction estimate stood. The registry was clear. The evidence of demolition without consent lined up. Judge Whitaker read her ruling slowly, and each word landed like a bell. The court found in my favor damages for reconstruction, preservation penalties, legal fees, $890,000 for the rebuild, plus penalties and equitable relief. Equitable relief, as Tom explained later, meant the court could order more than money. Given that the Harringtons had initiated construction on the cleared footprint, the judge authorized removal of any structures benefiting from the unlawfully cleared area. When she said those words, the room held its breath. The cabana had been designed to take advantage of the space they created. Without that cleared sightline, its layout made no sense. Outside the courthouse in the parking lot, Colin cornered me and said, "This is insane. You're going to tear down our cabana," I said. "You tore down my history." He shrugged and threatened an appeal. They did, and the motions came and went, but the judge denied stays. Compliance was immediate. So one gray October morning, I stood on Lake Alder while a crew brought the cabana down, this time under court order, permits, paperwork, a sheriff's deputy to keep the peace. I won't pretend the scene felt purely joyous. Watching any structure fall is a strange mix of vindication and melancholy. Satisfaction sat next to something heavier because demolition is final no matter which side stands behind the controls. When the first beam buckled and the sleek frame groaned, part of me thought, "Now you understand." Part of me remembered my grandfather stacking ice, and how different that kind of work is. It builds community, not Instagram-ready vistas. They tore down the cabana in 2 days. The polished concrete was broken up shoreline, regraded the footprint, restored. The Harringtons paid the judgment, appeals were withdrawn, and the fines and fees were settled. People expected me to immediately start rebuilding, dramatic music first, stone laid with triumphant montage, but that's not how memory works. You can replicate stone and timber, you can hire the best masons and sink the money into authenticity, but you cannot recreate a lineage of hands that held those tools or the stories that passed under that roof. I will rebuild, yes, but not hurriedly. For now, the original foundation stones sit stacked by the water, and I visit them, run my hand over the rough edges, and remember the winter of ice and community and how we used to depend on one another instead of consultants and sightline studies. So what's the lesson? Not some sermon, just a crooked little truth I felt in my chest after months of court dates and late-night thinking. Respect has a geography. Boundaries matter not just legally but culturally. History is not merely aesthetic, it's obligation. When someone with more money decides that your past is ugly or inconvenient, the easier route is to look away. But if everyone looks away, then what keeps any neighborhood anchored? That realization is humbling and a little terrifying because it means vigilance and sometimes legal fights are part of stewardship. Colin and Rebecca still live next door. We nod when we pass. There's no friendship, just civility, and the lake looks different now, cleaner, more open, some people say better. But every time I glance at that stretch of sky where the ice house stood, I remember what it cost to keep the precedent from being set, not just dollars, but the months of stress, the gossip, the strain on neighbors. You can take the money or you can take the fight. I chose the fight because letting it slide felt like giving people permission to erase other people's histories next. So I'll ask you, if someone bulldozed a piece of your family's history because it didn't match their aesthetic, what would you do? Settle for a plaque, take the check and move on, or stand in court and watch steel come down to make a point? Drop your thoughts below. I want to know where you land on this. And if you believe boundaries still matter, if you think history is not disposable because someone wealthier moves in next door, hit like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes justice isn't loud, sometimes it's just standing on your own shoreline and knowing the line is still yours.